Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Mason. I'm with the Arizona International Film Festival. I'm here with my very distinguished colleague, Ann Dalton. Ann, you want to wave? Say hello. We are here today with four very talented, brilliant, innovative, impactful documentary filmmakers. And we want to talk to them and we want to shine a light on their films. Each one of them has a film in the festival this year. One of the filmmakers took it a little too greedily. She has two films. One is not enough. And we want to talk to them about these films and about documentary filmmaking, about shooting film in Arizona, and all kinds of other things. Those of you watching, thank you so much for tuning in. At the bottom of your screen, you will see on the far right a Q&A button. If you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to type those in, and we will be taking those as we go along. So let's get right into it. The first thing I would like to do is, starting over here with Lisa, is to ask each of the filmmakers, oh, by the way, here's the films they have in the festival. Lisa Molomot is with Soledad. Juliana Piccillo, Whores on Film. John Sheedy, Rosa Sanctuary. And John Wright, Imprisoned for Profit. Great films. If you haven't seen them, buy a ticket, get a pass, look at them. They're awesome. Let's start with Lisa. Lisa, please say hello. Give us a little of your background. Give us a little of your story up to the making of your film.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me to this panel. This is really interesting. I'm curious to hear what other people have to say. But I'm Lisa Molomot. I'm a Tucson-based documentary filmmaker, and I teach at the University of Arizona. And I actually studied filmmaking at the American Film Institute in Los Angeles, and I studied editing. And so I have an MFA in editing. And the interesting thing is that the American Film Institute focuses on narrative filmmaking, not documentary. But I was working on documentary before I went to AFI. And when I left AFI, I decided I wanted to go back into documentary. And I continued to edit documentaries, and then just took the leap and started making my own. And also at the same time began teaching filmmaking. So what brought me to Tucson was the University of Arizona. My husband and I both teach filmmaking at the university. And I began, looking around for stories in the Southwest when I got here. And one of the first things I worked on was a short film called The Cleaners, about some undocumented workers who were experiencing wage theft by their employer, and they approached the workers' rights clinic at the University of Arizona Law School. And the students helped these women basically, approach their employer and, bring a case against their employer, and they won. And I was so inspired by these women. Not only did they know their rights, but they were going to fight for their right. And so I was inspired by the law clinic and the students, but I was really inspired by these women. And when I finished that project, I kind of was looking around the law school a little bit more to see if there was anything else interesting going on. And that's how I came to the film Soledad.
Excellent. So much in there. Thank you so much. Mr. Wright.
Yeah, so thanks everybody. As well, it's a great thing to be here with you all. I'm from Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I was in media studies in high school and things like that. And by the time I graduated high school, so to speak, we don't use that word over there, but it's the same thing. We got done with high school and I went right into media jobs. I was in radio and things like that for many years, and I took a job like that out here after I got married to a girl from Arizona, and that's how I came to Arizona to do, starting really the same thing, by 2010, I was starting to do, starting to just explore an interest in documentary. And I had always loved the form. I think it's a powerful medium. And so had always been attracted to it. And I started to do more and more of the stuff that I had been covering in my radio career in a documentary way. And so it's just that, it's just storytelling, right? And so, but it's a combination of a few things that I really, really like. And so that's how I got here.
Excellent, excellent. And welcome from Northern Ireland. That's quite the journey in itself. Mr. Sheedy.
Oh, so I'm John. I'm a filmmaker and a teacher. I teach film at the Verde Valley School up in Sedona. I really got into documentary film, I'd say back in the early 2000s. I was going to getting my master's degree in Tucson. And well, I decided to do my thesis on immigration and had lots of opportunities to volunteer for organizations on the border. And the more I got into it, the more I realized I wanted to do a documentary about immigration on the border. So I did the story of a hate crime about a young man who was murdered on the border. I spent 2 years working on it, and it showed at the Arizona International Film Festival and went on to many other film festivals. I guess you could say I got hooked after that. Went on to make a second documentary feature length about the kids who live in the Tijuana garbage dump out in Tijuana. And then from there, I met my wife, who lived in Sonora at the time. She now works at the U of A in Tucson. But she and I decided to start a cross-cultural film festival. So for 10 years, we've been running the Alamos International Film Festival, which is across the border in Alamos, Sonora, focusing on stories from both sides of the border, just sharing culture from the border, the environment, indigenous life, immigration. So we've really dedicated the last 10 years to doing that. We've teamed up a bit with the Arizona International Film Festival, always representing films from Arizona. So it's been a great cultural exchange, hearing voices from both sides. Ultimately ended up here in Sedona. And so we spend our time between Sedona and Tucson. And 2 years ago, I got invited, or I got an opportunity to receive a grant to do the story of Rosa's Sanctuary.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. Much in all of these stories to look into. And Juliana, finish it out for us. Tell us a little bit about your story.
Well, I guess I had been a journalist when I started making films. I was working for the Associated Press in Boston, and I was on that track. And I also was doing film reviews for a bunch of small papers in Boston. And I loved film because film was really like something that gave me a lot of comfort and hope and a blueprint for a different kind of life than the one I had, that, how I grew up in a smaller town and working class and that kind of thing. So film was extreme. Film wasn't escape for me. Film was like, how do you live your life? Or how can I see myself? What are the possibilities? So film was very near and dear to me. And as a film critic, I got to see so many amazing films and got the bug. And so I started making films, just little indie films, showing at little indie festivals and stuff like that. And then I moved out to Arizona. I was working on editing a film that I had shot in Boston, and I wanted to come somewhere beautiful and get out of the rat race. And I had saved some money to take a year off to edit. And I ended up getting offered a teaching job at the U of A in the media arts, what was then the media arts department. And so I started teaching film and had access to equipment for free. So that was great. And so I really wanted to make a film about having been a sex worker as a teenager. So I was a teenage prostitute while I was teaching at the U of A, which my colleagues were, I think, not entirely supportive of and thought was sort of a joke, which just inspired me all the more. And that film premiered in Tribeca. And then I had always had this dream of making the film that I just made, because I saw this film, The Celluloid Closet, like in the 80s. I reviewed it, I guess, or something. I don't even remember, 90s or 80s. And it was about how gay people were depicted in mainstream media and how these depictions interact with our culture and how that stigma affects real people's lives and harms them. And so I felt like we really needed a film like that about sex workers because they are such a huge staple of mainstream cinema, all forms of media, news, television, all of it. And these things, it's a feedback loop. People think they know so much about sex workers because they see so much in the media, but what they see is not really the whole story. In fact, it's a really small part of the story. And so that led me to make this film.
Excellent, and we'll get back to that. That is such a tremendously interesting story. All right, Lisa, let's go back to you and give us a little of the background on Soledad. How did that, flesh that in for us a little bit on the making of that film?
Right. So as I mentioned, after making The Cleaners, I was interested in looking around the law school to see if there were any other interesting stories or things going on there. And I met the lawyer who is featured in Soledad, Shafali. And I think after talking with her for 20 minutes, I was like, I want to work with her. She just is such a dynamic person. She was telling me about this case. She has so much energy. And I never met anyone actually like her before. And I knew I wanted to collaborate with her, and I could tell she was creative as well. So we talked about it. She reached out to Soledad, which is not her real name. And she was up for participating in the film. So we started from there. I mean, there were many, many challenges in making the film, in the sense that, here's a woman that's experienced gang violence and torture and had to leave her home country because of it, but some of her family is still in her home country. So every step of the way, we have to be very careful about her identity and how far the film goes out into the world, which is a very different situation for me from my other films. I mean, because usually you want to reach as many people as possible with your films, right? But in the case of this film, we're being very careful. It's being distributed by New Day Films, which is a collective where I actually have control over where the film ends up. So that's great. I mean, we didn't want to film her in silhouette because part of it is we wanted to really make the story of an asylum seeker less abstract for people and more human. And so we really wanted to be able to see her face. And that meant making compromises with the distribution, and also just being extremely careful about not putting the film on the internet for all to see. And but I'm happy with the choice. It's a little stressful having that weight on me. I've never had that situation before, but I think we made a good choice. And yeah, I'm really happy with how it turned out. I mean, obviously we didn't have access to the Eloy Detention Center. I mean, I've been in Eloy, and the only thing you can bring in there is a piece of paper and a pencil. So I knew I wasn't going to be able to film in there, but it gave me an opportunity to work with someone on the animation, which I've never explored using animation in my work before. So that was a new experience for me, and I really enjoyed how that went. And now I, of course, want to use animation and everything because it's so cool and interesting in a way that it's there are things you can do with animation that you can't do with live. There are ways that you can bring out emotion in a way with animation. It just was an interesting process. And the woman that did the animation, she actually lives in England. She lives near London, and I never met her in person, just, over the internet. We did Zoom calls together, and she's a young woman, and she's very talented, and I was very lucky to find her. And her mother was an immigrant. She grew up in Portugal, and her mother was from Africa. And so she was really interested in the story and was willing to work with me for the peanuts I paid her. So that worked out really well.
Thank you so much. A great story and much to unravel as we go along. John Wright, tell us a little bit about Imprisoned for Profit.
Well, I find it fascinating that, Lisa, your film began with this meeting with a lawyer, and that this prison in Eloy was a part of that story, because that's exactly how this film got started too. Imprisoned for Profit is about a lawyer who has been working in private practice a long time and began to view the private prison system, this sort of use by states and the federal government and other entities to use private prisons instead of government-run facilities. He began to view it as immoral. And more than that, he believed that it was unconstitutional. So I met with John Dacey, the lawyer in the film, who works here in Phoenix. And again, just like Lisa, very quickly I knew that it's a story that I thought deserved a larger audience. John is a very he's a very straightforward guy. I wanted to put him on camera, in a studio so that it would be completely just, isolated, just him. I love to do that anyway. I'm a huge fan of interviews, and so I love a really good interview. And he's so precise with his wording. So when you see the film, that's how he talks in real life. If you have coffee with John Dacey, he talks like that. But yeah, it's an interesting story. We interviewed a couple of people, but mostly it was revolving around John, and I wanted to tell it in sort of as pure and simple a way as possible, and just talk about why he thinks it's unconstitutional for the government to use private prisons and what he wants to do about it, which is essentially to file a case that makes it all the way to the Supreme Court.
Excellent. Thank you so much. John, Sheedy, Rosa Sanctuary.
Okay, so Rosa Sanctuary was introduced to me about 3 years ago. An arts organization in Colorado contacted me and offered me a grant to share the story of Rosa, who had just gone into sanctuary in a church in Colorado. This is Mancos, Colorado, a small town here in the Four Corners. And I was very interested in it because I thought, here's a form of immigration that's not right on the border. And I also saw a connection to Tucson because living in Tucson, I had heard about sanctuary and the history of sanctuary, which started in Tucson back in the 1980s. So the sanctuary movement started during the Civil War in Central America when refugees were fleeing to the US. And John Fife and members from the Presbyterian Church said, hey, these people are fleeing for their lives, much like we see, with some of the people who are like the story with, the woman who ended up in the prison from Central America. Nowadays, it's the same thing. They're fleeing from gangs. And only back then it was fleeing from violence from the war, and which was, fueled by the U.S. And so the Presbyterian Church said, hey, let's do something about this. Let's help these people. They created kind of an underground railroad on Arizona border. They started sheltering folks in churches. And many of you may know that if ICE agents want to go after somebody, churches are one place that they can't enter with a search warrant. So I thought, well, look at this. We've gone full circle. This sounds like an important story to cover. So about 3 years ago, I started working on Rosa's Sanctuary. She had been in for 1 year. This is going on her 4th year now. So as a result of basically her residency not being renewed under the Trump administration, she lost her residency. Then when her mother passed away, it put her back to 0 with her citizenship application. So here's this woman who'd been in the US for more than 30 years, important part of the community. And well, she hasn't left the church for almost 4 years now. So I spent a year with Rosa just documenting her story and what it's like. Ironically, many of us went into quarantine last year, and Rosa said, wow, kind of feels like what I'm going through. So that's a little bit about why it was interesting to me, and especially the connection with Tucson and the fact that the sanctuary movement started in Tucson.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Juliana, Horizon Film.
Yeah, so like I said, I had this idea for the film for quite a number of years before I did it. There's not a lot of scholarship on representation of sex workers in the movies. And so I had to really do like PhD level dissertation research to really feel like I knew everything about the history. watched a lot of movies, and it was great to do it. I spent years really just doing the background work on it because, you know, I made this film for my community, which is sex workers. I also and so I wanted to do right by them. And I also made it for people who want to learn more about sex workers, for the larger public. So I felt like I had to really get it right. It was like a lot of pressure to do the film. And I also, you know, if you make a film that's essentially about media literacy and exploring tropes in film and stereotyping and stigma in film, you better not like commit those sins yourself, right? So I really had to think a lot about how I was interviewing people, because when you interview sex workers, there's very specific conventions we see every frickin' time, right? A sex worker is on the screen. And sex workers ourselves, when we're interviewed, we can default to these tropes too, because we know what people are trying to elicit from us, right? So I did a lot of work around really deeply understanding those things and thinking about how I wanted to tell the story. And it was very important to me to show how powerful and smart sex workers are. We have so much trauma porn around sex workers. And the mainstream always depicts them as pitiable and, you know, addicted and all kinds of troubled. And that's not the reality. That's a small segment of the sex working community, but that's the one the public's interested in because our society is obsessed with trauma porn. We want to see people's trauma, their pain, their degradation, under the pretense of raising awareness, which doesn't really translate into action or reduce stigma and better lives for the people that we're raising awareness about. So I really wanted to show people like these are some powerful, smart, amazing, diverse people. And so I set about putting together the group of people and interviewing them and putting the story together.
All right, excellent. Thank you all so much. Great stories, very interesting, much to discuss. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Ann Dalton. She is, as I think you guys know, she is a very accomplished documentary filmmaker herself. She's on the board of the film festival. She's been a mainstay of filmmaking in Tucson for many years. And Anna's going to take it from here for ask you a few questions. Ann?
Thanks, John. Okay, here's a general question. How does where you live influence what films you choose to do? Anybody can go first.
It doesn't influence me. I mean, the only thing that influences me is money. So in that regard, it has to be logistically feasible. But yeah, like I wouldn't make a film set in China because I can't afford it. But yeah.
So for me, my very first feature was when I started it when I first moved to New Haven, Connecticut, and I was unemployed. I followed my husband there, who had a teaching job there, and so I had some time on my hands, and I wanted to understand the new city that I was living in, and I heard a story, an interesting thing that was going on, and so I began to follow it with my camera as a way to make sense of this new place that I was living. And so I think for me, actually, it's the opposite of Juliana. I really I use my films to understand things, and so what better thing to understand than the place where you're living, and especially when you move to a new place. And you know, one of the reasons why I started working on Soledad and Missing in Brooks County, which is the feature that played at the festival, was because I was new to the Southwest and I wanted to explore stories of the Southwest and to understand this place better. I also made a film called Teaching in Arizona, which you know, was an exploration of the teaching profession here. So for me, it's very important, the place. So it's actually complete opposite.
I think I've kind of had both experiences, honestly. You know, it's been sometimes where a film will take me to the other side of the country, And then sometimes, the stories in front of you are the ones that are there because of where you are. And that was the case with, some films I made with tribes here in Arizona and stuff like that, that I just wouldn't have had access to. People in Europe where I'm from don't know that Native Americans are here. So, it was really great, honestly, to be able to do those films and become a trusted person with those people and trusted to tell their stories as an outsider. But that wouldn't have happened without location and proximity. So I think it matters sometimes and not others.
Okay, thanks. Now, how is it different shooting in the Southwest in Arizona versus other places? Are there specific challenges or advantages, or can you say a little bit about that?
The heat.
Is that a plus or a minus?
It's not usually a plus in the summer, at least.
Yeah.
So
What about in terms of resources and access to equipment and gear and permitting, all the logistics of filmmaking and talent and crew, that type of stuff?
for me, I usually work with a pretty small crew, so I don't think that there's been any limitations there. I like to go into places where it can be fairly invisible. And I guess back to the previous question, like I've mostly focused my work on the borderlands in Arizona, a little bit out in Tijuana. I just love the borderlands. I've lived both in Arizona and Sonora, so I've seen both sides, and I just have a great appreciation for the culture. And I think there's a lot of challenges that we need to overcome too, and want to share voices from the borderlands. So my work really focuses here on Arizona-Sonora border.
That leads me, has everybody answered, first of all, had something to say? Okay, well, that leads me to the next question. How has, and I think Juliana has addressed this, how has your art been shaped by both the money you have had or not had?
Is
I
that-
mean,
It's limiting, it's hard to get funding now. And it's always been hard for me to get funding for sex work related films, because unless you're making a film that's about sex trafficking and trauma porn, people don't want to give you money, because I think people are scared too to be viewed as like sympathetic or like indifferent to trafficking by funding something that is pro decriminalizing sex work explicitly, But I never let money get in the way of making a film. I'm going to make what I want to make, and I'll figure out how to pay for it. And I have, luckily I do commercial work, and, I've crew people that I've paid handsomely for, regular jobs. And so I get them to work for free on my documentary stuff, or for lunch and stuff like that. So, but yeah, funding is a real issue. It's very difficult to make a feature film without funding. I mean, when I was a teenage prostitute years ago, it was a short, and I raised like $25,000, no problem, in grant money. And when I made this feature, I couldn't raise any money. I finally gave up on it. I figured it was not a good use of my time to keep getting no money, so.
yeah, I would say pretty much she said exactly what I would have said, which is it's really difficult to make a film without funding, but it's very difficult to get funding. But I never let that get in the way. I figure out a way to make the film that I want to make despite that. And yeah, I mean, with Missing in Brooks County, we had, enough funding to go to Texas 15 times and pay for our travel expenses. Well, we got into debt at a certain point, but we were pretty good most of the production. And then, as we were getting ready to finish the film, we knew we needed money for the composer, for the sound mix, for the color, for all the expenses. And we were ready to rob a bank, and then money came in. Once we had a film to show, a rough cut, a very far along rough cut, people started to get excited about it and give us money. And so then I felt like I was living on a mansion by the water. It was like, but the whole time of, in production, it was like, stressful, but I wasn't good. We weren't going to stop filming. Luckily, I shoot, and the co-director of the film also shoots, and my husband is an editor, and I'm an editor, and so we have like enough people to, you know, work on the film for no pay, you know, but it is very stressful, and it's a reality of documentary filmmaking, and I don't think it's ever going to change.
Glad you didn't have to rob a bank.
Me too. So I'm here with you today.
Yeah. Yeah.
A couple of subsidiary questions to this. Juliana mentioned this, and I think a couple of others too. Number one, where do you get your money? Number one, with all discretion recognized, and you can answer any way you would like, could you share the budgets for the films that we're talking about? Two, you mentioned grants. What's the scene like now for grants out there? And what about things like NEH and NEA? Are those viable at all for your types of projects? And again, not to put the U of A on the spot, but are there some avenues within the educational institutions you work in for supporting your work?
Well, I funded this film entirely by myself. So as a result, I didn't do a budget because I didn't want to know what I was spending. I initially did a lot of different cities. And so each one of those cost me probably $3,000 or something, because I had to hire crew in other cities because I didn't know them, you know. But I edited myself, I color corrected myself. I did everything myself, except I didn't shoot myself for the most part. I hired a composer, but was very generous because he liked the film. And but yeah, I don't even know what I spent. I mean, I paid anybody in my film who was a POC or a trans person, you know, gender nonconforming person was paid to be in my film. And I didn't pay any of the white people to be in my film, to be blunt, because I just felt like for my personal values, that was the right thing to do. But other than, you know, I did most things I didn't pay for, you know, most things I did myself or pro bono.
I personally have never gone the traditional grant route for any documentary I've done. This one was not an expensive film to make, but that's largely because, I mean, so I made it for, you know, I think hundreds, not thousands. And I think but that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't, through other work. And I think someone mentioned commercial work. You know, I do some of that as well, where sort of documentary style can be used in a way that benefits, say, nonprofits or brands, or, you know, and so through work like that and just building up a lot of gear myself, a lot of, you know, all of the tools of filmmaking, right? I can then turn, you know, a minority of my time towards toward making the films that I want to make, like this one, that I think are important on their own merits, without much of a budget.
Right.
So mine was on a pretty low budget, even though I had a grant, going into a church and kind of invading somebody's personal space. I decided to shoot mine on an iPhone. So I think with technology where we're at now, where everything has gotten smaller, like I believe it's easier to do some of this work on a lower budget if you're in a space where you don't have to travel a lot. So that worked out pretty well for me. I do see that there's not as many grants as there used to be as well.
Well, thanks. Now, as documentarians, what do audiences want? Is this something you think you should even ever wonder about? Or do you wonder about it?
I mean, I wonder about it in the sense that the appetite for viewing other people's trauma and monetizing people's trauma is very disturbing to me. And I think the preponderance of new documentary work does that. And that worries me about people. But no, I think about the community I'm representing, which is my community. That's the only audience I think about really intently, I think. I don't know. I think if you try to predict what audiences want to see and make work like based on what you think people want to see, it'd be harder to do, because I think you have to be so passionate and in love with the film to finish it, especially when you have low money, that I don't know if you could sustain that if you were strictly trying to like feed a niche in the marketplace.
Good point. I think part of it is that audiences don't know what they don't know about too. And I think it's part of documentary to open their eyes.
Mm.
Other
I mean,
comments?
I often think of myself as the first audience. Like I usually take on subjects that I'm curious about or interested in exploring. And I don't actually know what I almost always don't know what the story is going in, but I just have a feeling there's something interesting there. And so in a way, when I watch my films, I think of it as an unfolding of what I learned in the process of making it. So I guess I am always thinking about the audience, but myself being the first audience. And also, like Juliana, I mean, for me, the most important thing is that my participants are happy with the film. And so I'm always very nervous to share the film when it's done or nearly done. But if they recognize that I've done a good job in documenting their story, to me, that's everything. And then all of the other accolades, praise is icing on the cake. But if they are good with it, and I'm thinking mostly about Brooks County, but it really means everything to me that the participants are happy with how it turned out and supportive and wanting to be part of the impact campaign and all of that. And so you just hope for that. And I've never had it not happen, but I mean, it could, and that will be hard when it does, if it does.
Okay, so
There's a related question to that that I'd like to ask. The Dan's question about audience kind of implies to me your distribution plan. In other words, who do you want to show it to when you finished it, and how are you going to get it there? And I'm curious in your cases. I know I think almost all of you have had award-winning films at festivals, and Lisa, you've had work on PBS and POV, and so you guys have gotten things out there. But in the making of these films, was there a question in your mind or a thought? I want this on public television. I want this theatrical. I want this streaming someplace. Is that part of this audience issue as well?
I think it's definitely part of the audience issue. I just don't know if we have the luxury sometimes of feeling, it depends on the project, because sometimes if it is more of sort of a passion piece or something that you really think is important yourself, but you don't know what the audience is, I think distribution is an open question for a lot of things when you start them. And then maybe by the time you're done, you figure out where it could find a home. Or at least that's the way I sort of think about it. And so it just varies.
Yeah, I knew that I was going to have an educational market for my film, so that was definitely an agenda. Like that was the easy one. Like I knew universities would buy it and all that stuff. But I have a distributor and First Run Features, and they want to do the whole thing, which we're planning on rolling out in the fall, depending on COVID cooperating. But yeah, I mean, I want my film to be on every freaking platform that will have me, for sure, because I'm an activist, and this isn't a film as an extension of my activism. So I want it to be seen far and wide, but you have no guarantees of anything when you make a film. So.
Well, with Missing in Brooks County, we went the PBS route for funding, ultimately ITBS funding. And so the film will be on Independent Lens next fall, and that's a way to reach millions of people. And we knew we wanted to reach millions of people. But, in some ways more important than that is what we're working on now, which is the impact campaign. for that film. And so we are, having meetings and screenings and discussions with ACLU and WALA, Washington Office on Latin America, and the Red Cross, and just on and on. There are a lot of amazing people working on the issue of missing in Brooks County. And so we are partnering with them to get the film in front of elected officials, Congress. That's what's on my mind. I mean, I think, it's great for everyone to see the film. Like Juliana said, I just want everyone to educate themselves on this issue and really understand the crisis that's going on with migrant deaths. But really getting it in front of the right people. And it's not, progressive Democrats, it's moderate Democrats that can really, bring people on board with this and make this a bipartisan issue and make some change finally after 3 decades of prevention through deterrence and killing thousands and thousands of people. Like, that's what's on my mind. After working on this for 5 or 6 years, it's a little less about, the person sitting at home watching it on PBS, although that's great too, but it's really like making some kind of, change in the policy, border policy.
Lisa, give us a quick primer on working with PBS. How do you get money out of PBS?
Well, you have to keep applying. So we applied for ITVS funding 3 times and got rejected all 3 times. And then the 4th time, it was, I co-directed the film with someone else, and we, one time I'll write it, one time he'll write it, one time I'll write it. It takes a lot to write these grant applications. So on the 4th time, I was like, okay, you know what? They don't want our film. And I think we're too far along, and, we're not going to get funding. But Diane Kwan, a documentary producer who came on as a consulting producer on the film, was like, write it, just try one more time. And I was like, Diane, I just called them and they told me we're too far along. I looked on the website, I think we're too far along. She's like, just apply. So I did. And, I didn't put my heart and soul into the application, to be honest, because I had written so many grant applications before, and I just got it done, sent it off, and we got the funding. And, that was the 4th time we applied, but we had a film to show. We had a really solid rough cut, and they could see the film finally, and then we got the funding. And, it's amazing to get that kind of money for your work. I'm used to, just piecing things together in terms of smaller grants. And, but, I also have to say Fork Films, which is Abby Disney's company, came on board pretty early on the film and gave us money and support. And that was when we didn't even have a film. So to me, I'm actually most grateful to them, because they believed in this project before it was really a project. And it really, they were so critical in all of this, and they helped us get some more funding. But working with PBS is amazing. I have nothing bad to say. Always when you are with other filmmakers, people complain about a myriad of things about anything, but my experience working with them, they let you do all of the creative work. They give you money. You have to document all of your expenses, which is, difficult and time consuming, but it's government money. So you have to do that. And I am so grateful for PBS and what they do. And also the PBS audience is sort of 50-50 liberal conservative. So I felt like that was really good for our film, our particular film, to have a bipartisan audience was really important for this particular film. So it really worked out well for us. But I don't know, the next time I make a film, I'm probably going to be like, working at McDonald's. So, just because you have one success does not mean your next film is going to be easy peasy. So.
Right.
John, I thought maybe we could ask some individual questions about people's particular films, specific questions.
Sure.
I wanted to ask Juliana, as an advocate, is one of your goals to get sex work legalized in more states than Nevada?
Yeah, I mean, what we're working on as a movement is decriminalization as opposed to legalization. Legalization, it's a fine point maybe to some people, but legalization is a lot of control and very invasive government presence in the workplace. You know, in Nevada, people have to get tested for STDs on this strict schedule. They can't leave the workplace. They have to stay on site. It's incredibly restrictive. And given the fact that STIs and HIV rates are not high in this demographic as they are in senior citizens and other populations, it's not warranted for the government to insert themselves. So yeah, we want decrim, which basically means there are no laws on the books that make it illegal to be a sex worker. There might be zoning requirements like any business where you can and can't do business, but nothing that criminalizes the actual work. So it's decrim. So yeah, that's the agenda. And we're seeing a lot of progress, especially right now. We're seeing reform prosecutors crop up all over the country who are no longer prosecuting sex work. They will still prosecute cases of trafficking and exploitation and violence, but they are not prosecuting consensual adult work in the industry. There's some bills in various states to decriminalize in those states, including New York State. So yeah, that is the goal, because criminalization results in violence to sex workers, and a single arrest can circumscribe somebody's future in the worst possible ways in terms of getting into higher education, getting housing, keeping custody of their children. So we want to reduce that harm. So part of my big agenda is to see these kinds of changes so that sex workers have safe, healthy lives, So yeah, for sure.
Very interesting. Have you seen any films made talking about the advantages to the clients who hire sex workers?
Not off the top of my head. I mean, maybe little short things or YouTube things or something. I mean, that's not the point, honestly. Like, they may benefit in certain ways. Who knows? Don't know. Some may not. I don't know. But like anything else in life, people buy things that they may buy to excess. They may buy in ways that are beneficial and healthy for them and interact with it in a healthy, positive way. And, we don't get involved in that in this country. We let people buy alcohol or, do what they're going to do, whether we have ideas about that being healthy or not. So I think, embedded in that question might be those kinds of worries. But we're concerned about the safety of the workers, because this is a population that usually has a lot of intersecting vulnerabilities. There's a lot of people of color who are sex workers. There's a lot of trans people who are sex workers. A trans person of color sex worker is subjected to the most arrests and criminalization and restrictions on their lives in terms of just getting housing. Just the barriers to entry into straight work, if they want to exit sex work, are nearly impossible for a lot of folks. And so because the workers in this profession suffer so much stigma and so much harm, that's the concern, is how do we reduce harm to marginalized, vulnerable people?
I'd like to ask John Sheedy a question. Rosa Sanctuary is a very private, intimate film. We spend time with a woman alone in a church sanctuary. It's like we are special guests that she has invited into her very private space and home. How did you keep the filming simple and unobtrusive so as not to overwhelm this woman, and so she would feel comfortable in telling her story? Yet, of course, you had to shoot at a professional level with all the necessary crew and equipment. How did you pull that off?
I have to be honest, I started my relationship with Rosa began actually over Facebook. So once they gave us contact to set up and arrange times to meet, I said, let's just get to know each other a little bit, by Facebook, so I'm not just barging into your territory, into your space with my gear. And I decided that with the exception of my wife and my son who helped out a little bit with the film, that I was just going to have it be a one-person crew. So we spent about a month just sharing stories on Facebook, chatting every night after work, seeing how our day went. Found out that she liked to cook. And then once I went into her space, then it really just started, more like just sitting out on the porch. Like I mentioned earlier, I used a cell phone versus taking, a lot of gear in. So there's a lot of handheld camera, and I just wanted it to be that really simple feel to it. And then at one point I realized that just she was sharing her space with me, that sometimes we were filming in her bedroom and sometimes she was cooking, and there were once in a while she would send me on missions to check on her dogs back home and that type of thing. So that's just how the relationship evolved, and we've gone back to being friends on Facebook. Even though I'm back in Sedona, we check in once or twice a week and just chat and see how things are going.
Excellent. And a quick question for John Wright. On your website, you talk about your work as a combination of journalism and cinema, and that you have developed styles and principles in your approach to documentary. Could you summarize what these styles and principles are?
Man, yeah, well, so I mean, I suppose there I'm referring to principle of authenticity, probably, not trying to manufacture anything that isn't there. A lot of sort of what you might think of as sort of core principles of documentary filmmaking, but the storytelling, I do think style is important to me, on a level that I really want it to, I think, I've read a lot of sort of cinematographers, techniques and things like that, because I think it's really interesting how this is a sort of an intersection of a form of truth telling, a form of storytelling, but it's also cinema, and I think it has to be cinematic. I think it has to tell a story in a way that will really compel and inspire. And so I think that's what I'm referring to there. But yeah, a lot of that I think comes down to how are you going to approach an interview subject, and what kinds of things. I don't like to give questions to people in advance and things like that. I would like to sort of, shoot for 2-3 hours if I can, if I could. So I just think there's an approach to it that can yield a certain style that I want to try to kind of hone and get better and better at every time.
Would that cinematic quality also apply to like the image itself? I mean,
Yeah.
like memorable framing and
Yes.
cinematic style compositions?
Yeah, and I know there are different styles within documentary, some of which that's not as important, right? It doesn't matter as much, and especially I've watched a lot of documentaries with found footage and stuff like that. I mean, a film I just loved recently was that new Billie Eilish documentary on Apple TV Plus. That's almost all just cinema verite, just watching people and watching things happen. And in that case, it's very different than what I do.
Lisa, I wanted to ask you, what were can you mention just a couple of challenges about making Missing in Brooks County?
Well, aside from the funding, because we've already talked about the funding, which is always the biggest challenge. I mean, we made that film over the course of 5 years. So the challenges were always kind of changing. So at first it was sort of like when we decided, okay, we want to make a film about Brooks County, we would show up and they would say to us, oh, you should have been here last week when this was happening, and we would, pass the time in the Best Western Motel waiting for people to call us back, because in South Texas, when you reach out to people ahead of time to schedule filming, they'll say, oh, just call us when you get here. so we couldn't like plan anything. We had to like show up, be there. And those first, I would say the first year or so was a lot of just like waiting around the Best Western motel and just kind of like I walked, the motel, waiting for people to call us back. But then, once we sort of became like part of the fabric of the town where people recognized us and people started calling us back and trusting us, and we built rapport with people, and over time it just became easier and easier, and our story became more focused. So that made the filming itself easier. But finding the right family, or families plural, we have 2 families in the film, that was challenging because we actually did film with a couple of other families, and with both of them, the other 2 families that are not in the film, there were some mental health issues around what had happened. I mean, and we were feeling it, and we were feeling like, I don't think these people are ready to tell their story. And we had been filming with them for a while, and their stories were, great stories for the film, but we decided to stop filming with a couple of different families for that reason. And when we met the Romans, we could really tell they were ready to tell their story, and they wanted to participate in the film, and they were very eager to share their archival and all, the recordings from the guide, the coyote, and the border patrol, and all of the things they had documented along the way during this tragedy. And they handed it over to us, and they wanted to participate. So we were like, okay, have a family meeting, make sure everyone is on board. They came back to us, we're on board, and we had really good communication with that family. So there was a trust there, and we continue to have a really good relationship with them. They're participating in the Q&As and the impact campaign and all of that. So, it's over time, like things develop, but sometimes you have to let things go because they don't feel right. And you feel like you're, you always kind of feel like you're exploiting in a certain way, but you feel like, this isn't healthy for this family to keep reliving this nightmare, and we need to just let it go. And so, we continue to stay in touch with those people and keep them posted on the film and everything. They're part of the film, but they're just not in the film.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching, as they say in the commercial world, a hard commercial break. We're approaching the magic hour of 4 o'clock. How time passes quickly when we're having so much fun. We just started, didn't we? Anne, I've got 100 more questions.
Yeah, me too. I noticed there are 2 on Q&A, John. You think we should try to fill
Well, we're going to close with the big one. Okay. First of all, for those of you watching, please be aware that these films are, if you haven't watched them, all of them, they're still available online here at the festival. Go to filmfestivalarizona.com, grab these tickets. These films must be seen. There's stories here. There's a compelling, these are vital issues, very, very important, especially for Arizona, Southern Arizona. All of these are critical. And these films make a huge contribution to the dialogue around them. So please watch the films. They're still available. I want to thank each and every one of you so much for participating, but I'm not going to let you get off easy. There's a question that came in. What is the future of documentary filmmaking? Lisa, you started off.
Why am I starting it off?
Good luck.
I mean, I don't have a great answer to that because I really don't know. I know I'm going to continue to make films that I feel, that I feel are valuable to the world, and are, topics that are interesting to me that I hope are interesting to other people. It's difficult with the series though. It's, and the Netflix and the Amazon and the sort of the decisions of some of these places to not, take documentaries, for example, or to, create their own content. So it's tricky, but I don't know, these stories are powerful, and you can't make them up. And so I have hope that because of that, documentaries will continue thriving, because they're different from fiction films. It's a different thing. And that's why I started out in documentary. I kind of left for a little bit, and I decided I want to go back into documentary, because the things that I make films about, I couldn't create in my head, and write a screenplay that's more interesting than the stuff that I'm filming. So,
John Wright, how do you see the future?
I mean, I think there's a bigger and bigger opportunity to make the kinds of films that and more platforms for those films. And so I think it's going to be a case of, in a world where, almost anyone could pick up a camera and start to shoot, and the tools of editing are democratized and everyone has access. I think it's going to be a case of, may the most compelling stories be the ones that we hear about and see. And so I share Lisa's optimism. I think it's, an amazingly powerful medium. I don't know of a more powerful way to tell stories, honestly, although I'm biased toward this because I love it so much. But yeah, I think the platforms and the future looks bright for documentary. I really do.
Thank you very much. Wise words. John Sheedy.
I believe that documentary film has come a long ways in the last 20 or 30 years, and that people have more access to the tools and technology to make documentary films. You're seeing more creativity coming out, and I just believe that we need these alternative sources to the mainstream more than ever for the truth seekers and to document stories, whether it's an immigrant or somebody like Rosa, who just really represents dozens or hundreds of other people who may be in the same situation. So I think it's more important than ever.
And Juliana, final words. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with what everybody said. And I think people love documentary, and they love documentary more than ever now. And, it's democratized, but it's also not, yeah, anybody can shoot with an iPhone, but I think there's a lot of barriers to entry into becoming a documentarian whose work is actually seen. But I do think funders are starting to fund more work by people of color. And I think they're starting to be more critical of privileged people telling the stories of not privileged people, which I think is really positive, that hopefully we're going to see even more diversity with filmmaking. And I'm excited about these sort of hybrid stuff, like Nomadland, that narrative feature, because it used people that she met who were actually living this lifestyle. And I think that there's a lot of potential to sort of hybridize documentary and narrative, which is always exciting, I think, and always makes for, I think, great filmmaking. So I think the future is really positive, as long as, people can continue to make the work and find ways to get it out there. And there's a lot of venues, but it's still challenging.
Excellent. Wise words all. Ann Dalton, thank you so much. Filmmakers, thank you again. What I hear you say is that in the next year or so, we're going to reconvene and have another panel discussion here on documentary filmmaking, part 2 with the very same folks. Thank you again for sharing your thoughts and ideas. We wish you the very best in your filmmaking careers, and let's always stay in touch. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.